And once you do click that, then you should be able to select the language of your choice. Excellent. So at this point, I would encourage you to, in the chat, introduce yourself, just your name, your organization, potentially the country that you are from. I also want to identify that we have a question and answer section, which is separate from the chat. So as we proceed, any questions that you may have, please place in the question and answer section. We will try to answer those during the presentation, but as you will see, there will also be a distinct question and answer section where we can have some conversations as well. So at this point, I want to introduce the agenda. In the chat, you should find a link being posted by my colleague Bianca to the various resources that have been provided, as well as the agenda. And so you will see after my welcome, we will have some opening remarks. Unfortunately, the regional director from Mexico is unable to join us. And so Hyacinth Armstrong Vaughan, Protected Areas Officer at IUCN, will be giving those on her behalf. We'll then move to the WCPA Regional Vice Chair, Alan, to also provide some opening remarks. And then Hyacinth will come in and provide us with some context and linkage to the 30 by 30. Jose Coro, thematic expert at IUCN, will then provide an orientation to the tool, and we will look at a case study from Honduras. We will then have Emily Howland, who is Protected Program Officer at the UN Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center. She will then give us a presentation on the World Database on OECMs, and then we would move to a session looking at the development of a discussion paper for the Caribbean, which would include Benjamin Lucas, who is also a program officer, Emily, and myself. And then we'll move into the question and answer section, which would be led by Hyacinth. We would then look at next steps, which would be led by Jose, and then we would have the closing remarks. So just to remind you, the key outcomes that we're hoping with respect to this is to see how we can progress to the development of a discussion paper for the Caribbean with respect to OECMs and identification of stakeholders and partners interested in continuing the discussion on OECMs in the Caribbean. So as I get ready to hand over to Hyacinth, I will just introduce myself. My name is Julian Walcott, and I am the Technical Officer at the Caribbean Protected Areas Gateway. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Hyacinth to deliver her remarks on behalf of the Regional Director for IUCN.
Thank you, Julian, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you for taking the time to join us. As Julian indicated, the Regional Director for IUCN, the Regional Office for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, Mrs. Ursula Faria, unfortunately cannot join us this morning. She had an emergency, so she asked that I just bring her remarks on her behalf. So within the Convention on Biological Diversity, conserved areas have been referred to as other measures that should be considered to achieve global conservation targets. However, it was not until 2018 that the term other effective area-based conservation measures, known as OECMs, was formally defined. And since then, methodologies and processes have been developed to help parties define and identify OECMs. The adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in December of 2022 has catapulted OECMs to the forefront, especially in relation to Target 3, where the achievement of the effective and equitable conservation of 30% of land, freshwater, and coastal marine spaces by 2030 is of utmost importance. This goal can only be achieved if, in addition to protected areas, OECMs are included. The global arena sees a wealth of opportunities for effective and equitable conservation through OECMs. Often existing initiatives overlooked at the national level can now be acknowledged as countries' contribution to the Global Biodiversity Framework targets, benefiting local communities. This extends to emerging conservation endeavors not officially designated as protected areas, yet holding immense potential to foster biodiversity, ecosystem services, and livelihood improvements. Because of IUCN's commitment to the achievement of the targets established under the Global Biodiversity Framework, our organization, through its World Commission on Protected Areas, has developed state-of-the-art knowledge related to OECMs, including the international criteria to be met by potential OECMs, a guide to identify and evaluate OECMs in Central America, and supporting the International OECMs database incorporated into the World Database on Protected Areas, all of which UNEP-WCMC will further elaborate on later in the webinar. Leveraging on this expertise and resources of IUCN, our aim is to drive capacity development efforts forward for the Caribbean region. Therefore, we are excited to organize this webinar for the region as part of the BIOPAMA, which is Biodiversity and Protected Areas Management Program. Since 2018, BIOPAMA has been supporting improved management and governance of protected and conserved areas in the Caribbean. And in 2021, in collaboration with the Caribbean Protected Areas Gateway and the UNEP-WCMC, IUCN successfully conducted an introductory webinar on OECMs for the Caribbean. Today's webinar will take the process a step further by sharing recently developed guidelines and experiences from Central America that can be applied to or repurposed for the Caribbean context. IUCN, both through its Secretariat and its commissions, especially through the World Commission on Protected Areas, looks forward to supporting and guiding this process together with Caribbean countries, territories, and regional partners. I wish you all a good day, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Hyacinth. At this point, we'll now move over to Alan for some opening remarks as well.
Gracias por el espacio. El tema de OMEX para nosotros en la Comisión Mundial de Áreas Protegidas es muy relevante porque, como lo mencionaba Hyacinth, tenemos una meta muy ambiciosa que es alcanzar un 30% de protección a nivel planetario, tanto de tierras como aguas internas y mares. Pero no queremos que esto se vuelva un tema de cumplimiento cuantitativo únicamente. La meta 3 como tal, de las 23 que tiene el marco de Montreal, habla de que esos territorios tienen que ser eficazmente manejados, que tienen que tener una representación ecológica y que además deben estar integrados en sistemas. Esto implica que si vamos a hacer las cosas tenemos que hacerlas muy bien. Y hay una preocupación desde hace mucho tiempo, desde que se habla de las OMEX, primero de qué es, de cómo se come, de cómo se entiende, y después de que esto no vaya a ir en contra de los procesos de creación de áreas protegidas, porque sea un camino más fácil o por cualquier otra cosa para cumplir con alguna meta cuantitativa. Entonces, desde la Comisión y especialmente en Latinoamérica, el año pasado hicimos una serie de webinars que se llamaban Tenemos que hablar, que básicamente hacía que las personas que están trabajando en estos temas o que están interesados se pudieran encontrar en un espacio como este, que es tan oportuno, y pudiéramos hablar de nuestras preocupaciones, de hacia dónde vamos, de cuáles son esas metas, de qué implican, de cómo reportamos, de cómo hacemos para que sea sostenible, de cómo manejamos la gobernanza de estos espacios. Esto cerró en julio del año pasado con un taller presencial en Lima, con 50 personas de 14 países. Y derivado de esto también se creó una plataforma que en un ratito les voy a poner en el chat la dirección, pero es 30x30lac.com, Y la idea es que ese espacio se vuelva un repositorio para los temas que se están trabajando de OMEX, que se vuelva un espacio para saber quién está trabajando en cada uno de los países sobre estos temas, qué avances hay, y que nosotros podamos compartir recursos por ahí. Y también, a partir de este trabajo conjunto, se creó un curso de OMEX, que en este momento está solo en español, pero la idea es tenerlo también en inglés. Y en ese curso, en estos 8 meses, tenemos más de 520 personas que lo han llevado y de ellas 120, 126 lo han aprobado. Entonces esto nos demuestra también que hay todavía mucha necesidad de clarificar el concepto, mucha necesidad de desarrollar este tipo de eventos y también nos muestra que cuando hay experiencias avanzadas como la que tenemos en Latinoamérica de Colombia, los otros países pueden tener posibilidades de avanzar de manera más acelerada en sus conocimientos. Entonces, de parte de la Comisión Mundial de Áreas Protegidas, agradecer este espacio, invitarlos a seguir preparándose en este tema de OMEC y si puedo apoyar de alguna manera o si la comisión les puede apoyar de alguna manera, siéntase en la libertad de hacerlo. Les seguimos acompañando aquí en el taller. Muchas gracias por el espacio.
Thank you so much, Hyacinth and Alan, for those opening remarks. So now we're going to get into kind of the meat of the matter. So I hand over to Hyacinth, who will look at the context and the linkage of OECMs to the 30 by 30 target, which we are now working towards.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you, Alan, for those words as well. So my job is pretty much just to kind of orient us to OECMs, and you'll hear a lot more about OECMs as we go through, especially in Jose's presentation. Our regional director's remarks also gave us a little overview of where the whole concept and terminology of other effective area-based conservation measures came from. So now it doesn't want to advance. There we go. So again, just to give you a little timeline, in terms of the process of OECMs, they were included in the Convention's strategic plan for biodiversity in 2010, and specifically in the Aichi Target 11, where we were looking to achieve 17% terrestrial and inland water and 10% coastal and marine areas protection by 2020. And this would have been through ecologically representative and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. However, the term was never really fully defined. And so in 2016, the IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas had a task force developed at the request of the Convention on Biological Diversity to help develop guidance on, how we should define these OECMs. In January, draft guidance was developed, and through January, February, it underwent global review. And then it entered into consideration by the scientific body for Technical and Scientific Advisory Committee of the convention. And eventually in November, it was fully adopted at COP14 as Decision 14.8. And this was basically defining what an OECM is, and the criteria for identifying potential OECMs. Since 2018, there has been a lot of work, a lot of, deliberations on how do we actually engage and define and implement an OECM. And in our region, in the Caribbean, the conversation was not present at all. So in 2021, the BIOPAMA program, through the Caribbean Protected Areas Gateway and UNEP-WCMC, we hosted a webinar to just begin to raise awareness and sensitize our region and our parties in the region to the concept of OECMs, knowing that the negotiations for the new biodiversity framework was underway and that OECMs would play a part in some way in the new framework. Following that webinar, which is available in the resources that we shared for this current webinar, we now have the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. And within Target 3, this is now a reality for us, where we are looking to ensure and enable that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial, inland water, and coastal and marine areas are effectively conserved and managed through ecologically representative, well-connected, and equitably governed systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. We now have really a solid footing for figuring out how we can use OECMs as part of our achieving this very ambitious goal of 30% protection. Recognizing Target 3 is not only looking at the spaces we're protecting, but also recognizing the role of Indigenous and traditional territories in the process. And so this is also an added dimension that needs to be considered. And again, in the Caribbean region, given we have, if we're looking at the insular Caribbean, we don't have many, what we would call Indigenous territories. There are a few, or it's just Indigenous communities. But we do have within the wider Caribbean region, Indigenous and traditional territories. And we also have our local communities that also play a major role in the use and management of our protected areas. And so we now need to consider how we can start to envelop all of these elements into processes that can help us potentially achieve this target. So just to give you a quick concept, and Jose will probably dive into this a little bit more than myself, but protected areas as they are defined, they are geographically defined areas which are designated or regulated and managed to achieve specific conservation objectives. How does that relate to other effective area-based conservation measures? Well, they are also a geographically defined area that is not a protected area, but it is governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in-situ conservation of biodiversity, with associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. Protected areas should have a primary conservation objective and promote in situ conservation of biodiversity. And similarly, OECMs should deliver the effective in situ conservation of biodiversity, regardless of their primary management objectives. So while they are similar, protected areas have a very specific definition and focus, but now OECMs can add value to what protected areas do, and by extension, help us in achieving our goals and objectives in the convention. So as I said, OECMs can add to the existing coverage of targets. So right now we are measuring percentage protection of the terrestrial spaces, coastal areas, the marine spaces, through protected areas primarily. And predominantly in the Caribbean, that is what the case is. We have no recorded OECMs in the region. So any research that you do to determine what is the percentage coverage being achieved in the Caribbean, and then it's specifically looking at protected and conserved areas. OECMs can help us recognize areas for effective conservation of biodiversity beyond what currently exists as national systems of protected areas. So again, we're trying to expand what is possible because there are areas in our region that are providing services and biodiversity conservation. Can we now recognize them in a way that would allow us to report and say, hey, we are actually achieving what we are wanting to do with this specific target. It allows us to recognize roles of areas under multiple governance and management types. At the present stage in the Caribbean region, primarily the governance is at the level of our parliamentary governments. But as the target 3 indicates, indigenous territories, local communities, all have a role and are all contributing to biodiversity conservation. How can we recognize their contribution? And OECMs is one way of helping us to do that. And recognizing that OECMs can be represented across all ecosystems. There's no limitation. They can be in forest, they can be in coral reefs, they can be mangrove systems, any type of system that is providing biodiversity conservation and ensuring that we are equitably and effectively managing our spaces. Once they fit the criteria, can be considered an OECM. There's one thing that I want us to be mindful of, though, as we move forward in this realm of addressing OECMs and looking at what their possibilities are for the Caribbean region. When it comes to defining a space as an OECM, it does require the management or governing authority to give consent to the site firstly being assessed, and then any recognition being given to it and reporting of it. That is also required. So while we can go through all these things and say, okay, let's make this space an OECM, we have to recognize that the management and governing authority has to give consent. So what's possible for us going forward? I would like us to consider as we go through this webinar and beyond. There is technical guidance and analysis tools already available and published. Here are 2 potential reports already available by the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, and there are others in the works. Jose will walk you through another guideline that was recently developed and adapted for Central America. We have the technical expertise within IUCN, as Alan indicated, through the World Commission on Protected Areas. And we have knowledge networks available on the topic, not just regionally, but globally. So there is an opportunity for us to learn from the experiences that have already taken place, and there are many that have happened across the globe on this topic, on the application and the whole process of trying to define it for your relevant area. So that is available to us in the Caribbean to as we work on building out our experiences. In terms of existing guidelines, and specifically the one that Jose will present, there's an opportunity to adapt it for the Caribbean context. So again, can we start to consider what would be relevant for the Caribbean region in defining and guiding how we advise and adapt and utilize this OECM mechanism? And recognizing that the whole implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework is at the forefront of everyone's minds in terms of, how do we start to define our national biodiversity strategies and action plans? How do we start to put in place the resources needed to help us begin to address the various targets within the Global Biodiversity Framework? There are a lot of initiatives in the Caribbean region looking to see how they can support the Caribbean region in achieving the Global Biodiversity Framework, and a lot of specifically targeting Target 3. There's an opportunity to define our processes around OECM identification to align and hopefully help these initiatives be more aligned with what is needed for the Caribbean region. So I wanted to just use this to help us begin to, if you haven't already started to think about what is possible for your site or your country, please keep these things in mind, recognizing that this year and the next few months, and actually quite as early as next week, countries are convening to begin to discuss what mechanisms, what strategies need to be put in place at a national level for them to be achieving the Global Biodiversity Framework. And at the COP later this year, I would like the Caribbean region, or at least the members and the parties of the Caribbean region, to have some lobbying to say that they are actually moving ahead in particular direction, especially in the OECM realm. Having had this discussion started here at this webinar and going forward with support from all of the parties that are available to provide that assistance. So I will thank you very much for your time and hearing me. And I hope that as we go through this webinar, your questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. And of course, we look forward to engaging with you beyond this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyacinth. Before we move on to Jose, I just want to indicate that Alan, as indicated, did share the link to the 30 by 30 LSE platform and also a link to an OECM in Spanish. So you can have a look at that. And as Hyacinth said, yes, any comments, please feel free to put in the chat, and any questions that you may have as we progress, please feel free to use the question and answer section to do that. So with that, I'm going to pass over to our thematic expert, Jose, to give us an orientation to the tool.
Thank you very much, Julian, and thank you to all the previous speakers for setting the stage. I think this is a very relevant topic, and I would like to start with probably a bit anecdotal on when the countries were negotiating the global biodiversity framework. And there were concerns on increasing what was the target 11 of the Aichi targets from 17% land and 11% ocean to 30% everything. And there were local communities, indigenous communities in Latin America concerned about a frenzy of declaration of traditional protected areas, and therefore increasing overlap of these potential new protected areas, traditional protected areas, with the lands and territories owned by these local people, by these indigenous peoples. Something that already exists, but that with the declaration of more new traditional protected areas would increase the problem and therefore the concerns. Fortunately, we are looking at OECMs as a way to find an option to traditional protected areas to stand out, underline, showcase, if you will, conservation initiatives that have been taking place for decades in some cases, in other cases, new ones that are emerging in the different countries, and the Caribbean is not the exception. So having OECMs as an option and as a matter of discussion in our countries is very relevant as a way to achieve the targets, the 23 targets in the GPF, and also the reporting that countries have to submit as soon as this October, if I'm not mistaken, in Colombia, which will be the next COP. So it's these are exciting times, and the relevance of OECMs, particularly interesting for the progress of this of the targets in the GPF overall. I'm going to be presenting a little bit some background information, complementing what Hyacinth already presented, and also going deeper into the OECM's guide for identification and assessment guide of OECMs for Central America that we look forward to adapt to the Caribbean reality. And at the end, I will present briefly a case study where we tested the guide and we got very interesting results. OECMs have been perceived as a major contribution to the 30% that we want to achieve in conservation worldwide in Target 3 of the GPF. And that is a correct perception. However, as it has been discussed in other fora, the OECMs also contribute to other targets. And what you're looking at on the screen is just 4 examples where we believe that OECMs play a role. And Target 3 is there, but also Target 1 that discusses plan and manage all areas to reduce biodiversity loss. Target 2, where that seeks to restore 30% of all degraded ecosystems. And Target 4, which is after halting species extinction, protect genetic diversity, and manage human-wildlife conflicts. And you can see some of the topics inside the green circle: restoration, connectivity, representativity, genetic conservation, recovery and conservation of species, and so on. And we can make the case for some other targets of the 23 where the OECMs can play roles, in some cases very specific, case by case or country by country, but in general, they have potential to contribute to different targets. And just that, as a clarification that my dear friend Andrew Rhodes have made a couple of times when we discussed this topic, is the country shouldn't account the contribution of OECMs on all the different targets quantitatively, but qualitatively, because they have to be accounted for. And let's say one target, perhaps Target 3, but acknowledging that they contribute to other targets as well. These are the criteria that have been identified for OECMs in order to frame the concept and start realizing if an area or areas that we may have in a country, either the Caribbean or elsewhere, has the potential or fits within the framework of an OECM. And the first one is criterion A, which is easy, I think. It says the area is not currently recognized as a protected area. B is the area is governed and managed. We will talk more about that. In C, the site achieves sustained and effective contribution to in situ conservation of biodiversity. And D, associated ecosystem functions and services and cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values are present. As you can see, it's a variety of topics that are covered in the last three criteria. And regarding governance types, particularly, the four types of governance recognized by IUCN for protected and conserved areas. The first one is type A, which is governance by government, probably the one that we are more familiar with. Then shared governance, that for some places is called co-management, or shared management, or collaborative management. There are many terms that fall into this type of governance. And also private governance. These are mostly private reserves where individual owners, nonprofit organizations, or for-profit organizations participate setting aside landscape or geographies for conservation purposes. And finally, D, with the governance by indigenous peoples and local communities. Very important in the case particularly of indigenous peoples, conserved territories and areas, and also local communities. This is presenting already a framework for governance of all the different options that we may encounter in the field. And this helps us to approach with the right conservation actions and the right approach depending on this governance. But what is a key element that defines an OECM? Well, if there is effective long-term conservation results, regardless of these objectives, long-term conservation results. So there, if you have to ask some key questions to identify an OECM, what would you ask? Well, the first one, perhaps, is there important biodiversity in the area? Is it a protected area already, or does it overlap with the protected area? Do those responsible for governance and management agree that the area could be considered an OECM? This is very relevant. And also, has it been stated that the area should rather be considered under targets 5 and 10 on sustainable development? Again, like I said, OECMs can apply to different targets of the GPF. So when the site is more appropriately located or allocated to goals 5 and 10, then it wouldn't be accounted for in target 3. So we have the criteria, and we have the definition of those criteria, and also what we did with the construction of the guide was to identify under these criteria top criteria and indicators to be able to operationalize the guide and the identification and assessment of OECMs. And as you can see, like Hyacinth was explaining, OECMs and protected areas are together in the same target 3, and they have sort of a relationship based on the purpose of creation, where is conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services, is it a primary objective? Is it a secondary objective, or is an ancillary objective to achieve conservation goals? In the case of OECMs, as you can see in the graph here, OECMs must achieve effective biodiversity conservation independently from its objectives, like I said before. So it could have a condition of ancillary conservation here, or secondary conservation over here, or primary conservation over here. On the other hand, protected areas must have a primary conservation objective, And we can see here focus mainly on conservation in the case of protected areas. But here, where the primary objective of an OECM is conservation, it could easily, those are sites that could easily become protected areas over time because of the focus and the objectives of management. So there's an interesting relationship between protected areas and OECMs, and the idea OECMs are complementing the efforts that protected areas have been achieving for decades now. And in some cases of OECMs that have been doing similar efforts for similar amount of time, but not as recognized as the protected areas. So you can have a continuum, if you will, of intention to conserve biodiversity, where you could have in one end less intention to conserve biodiversity, and at the other end, more intention to conserve biodiversity. And between those two, you will have a wide array of options, perhaps, in more to the left, with ancillary conservations. You can have areas that have not been altered, like the deforestation or burning or hunting, or change the forest for a golf course or housing projects. Also, you can have sacred sites relevant and important to local people and indigenous peoples, or military areas that have include within their territory areas with forest and biodiversity, because it fits the purpose of the military bases and so on, as long as they need them. Objectives and priorities can change. Then in the case of secondary conservation, you can have areas for the protection of ecosystem services, like commercial species, water protection, natural disaster risk reduction, like in the case of some mangroves and so on. And more to the right, where more intention to conserve biodiversity, you can have indigenous and communities conserved areas, sites with international designations like Ramsar sites, biosphere reserves, World Heritage, and so on. In areas that meet the definition of protected area but are not or do not want to be designated as such. I want to clarify that in the case of international designations, World Heritage would not apply for OECMs because those are protected area normally. And biosphere reserves, only some parts may apply for OECMs because others normally in some countries are declared as protected areas, particularly the nuclear part of the biosphere reserve. Ramsar sites is different. In some countries are protected, and some others are not. And they are just recognized as important sites for biodiversity, and I've seen some cases recently in the last 2 years of several Ramsar sites that do not have governance or management directly, but are recognized at a national level. So those are potential OECMs right there. So some examples here based on what we have reviewed as background information for the development of the guide to OECMs. We have probable OECMs, indigenous lands and community lands, some marine and coastal areas that are protected for reasons other than biodiversity conservation. For example, sites with permanent fishing bans, some watersheds or part of them that serve cities and communities. Those are some probable examples of OECMs. Not probable OECMs, urban parks, temporary fishing bans, grasslands used intensively for cattle, seascapes or landscapes with objectives focused on the management and conservation of a limited number of biodiversity elements. So, for example, particular bands for individual species, or oceanic areas or forest management areas for large-scale extraction. And I will just add a comment here that I have heard, I'm not going to say names, but I have heard political authorities referring to large-scale agriculture projects as potential OECMs, which is certainly not applicable. And one particular example I remember is the pineapple plantations that are large-scale and heavy in the use of pesticides. And for some people, or at least one political authority in certain country that should remain nameless, was referring to that as a potential OECM. So we have the risk in this work with OECMs of greenwashing the concept, trying to put things that are not applicable as OECMs. In the case of Costa Rica, they did an analysis of legal framework, and they concluded that biological corridors are potential OECMs, private reserves that are not declared as protected areas, responsible fishing areas, biosphere reserves, like I mentioned before, the sections not declared as protected areas, fishing polygons and other restricted areas, lands managed for water conservation by communities, properties that are part of payment for environmental services programs or similar schemes, indigenous lands, and lands owned by government institutions, municipalities, universities, or demonstration farms. So this was the options that the country identified, and they will be exploring further with case studies, hopefully using the guide we have developed. So now getting into the guide and the structure, we use all this background information like you see on the screen, the CBD resolution, published scientific articles, input from the Colombian process, input from the Costa Rican process, the OECM's guides for fishing, and other more were very useful in the development of our guide. These are some photos for you to see of the collaborative effort we had in the development of the guide with people from Costa Rica, both from government institutions and also here, and also here local people with owners and managers of potential OECMs at the local level, reviewing the criteria and the indicators and telling us what made sense and what didn't make sense. Here's a case of El Salvador as well. And we were discussing with them how they see this applied in their country. Here was the session in Honduras as well. They were all very productive because we wanted to have a reality check with people so they could tell us this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, this is understandable, this is not understandable. And how do we make this happen? So the guide, and I apologize because the graph on the right is in Spanish. How do we see the implementation of the guide? So we see a potential identification of OECMs here in the green square on top. And then we have a phase one of preparation for the review, then a phase two of applying criteria A and C of the guide, and this define if the site meets those criteria and indicators. If the answer is yes, then move to phase three, and that's implementing the rest of the criteria, B and D. And then if it meets those criteria, then it qualifies as an OECM. If it doesn't meet the criteria, it moves to a phase four to prioritize actions for improvement. What does that mean? It means that, well, maybe the site meets most of the criteria and indicators, but is weak in aspects related to governance. So you need to strengthen the governance of that site along with the local people. Maybe requires formalizing the governance in a legal instrument or a policy instrument of some sort. And then by strengthening those criteria and indicators that the site doesn't meet up front, it will move it from a no to a yes. So developing actions and an action plan here on phase 4, very important when it's possible. If the no is just is from a condition that cannot be changed, then the site cannot be an OECM. Now, returning here to phase 2, if the site doesn't meet the criteria A and C, then it doesn't qualify as an OECM. In sites that qualify as OECM, I can move to a phase 5, which is monitoring the management effectiveness of the site in order to have a loop here of making sure that the site continuously meets the criteria of OECM. And this will require annual assessments of management effectiveness of the OECMs, keep fitting it into the system to demonstrate that the site remains meeting the OECM's criteria. Of these stages, like I said, the preparation is phase 1, a preliminary assessment in phase 2, the assessment of criteria and indicators A and C, B and D, the follow-up plan when necessary, things that need to improve. The management effectiveness assessment is phase 5, ongoing annually, and phase 6, which is reporting and disseminating the results, something that should be done at the national level, at the local level, and at the international level, like our friends from WCMC will be sharing with us later on. So we have the criteria. We have in each component, for instance, in the site is not recognized as a protected area, we have one sub-criterion and 2 indicators. In number 2, site has a defined governance and is managed. We have 4 sub-criteria and 6 indicators. Achieve and sustain effective contribution for in situ biodiversity conservation, 2 sub-criteria, 4 indicators, and functions and associated ecosystem services, as well as cultural and spiritual values are conserved, has 2 sub-criteria and 3 indicators. So that's the structure, the skeleton, if you will, of what the monitoring of the OECM will be. So if the site is not registered as a protected area, so the indicators refers to there is no evidence or official declaration of the site as a protected area, and the site is not spatially overlapped with a protected area. So means of verification for these indicators are laws, decrees, even maps that you can make accessible to anybody to demonstrate that that is the condition of the site. Regarding governance, criterion B, the site has a defined management model. The site has an instrument that allows planning and monitoring of management according to a set of objectives and goals. The management system ensures a in situ conservation of biodiversity. The relevant groups of interest are linked with the management of the site. And all these can be demonstrating with meeting minutes where decisions are made, where their people are consulted, where the monitoring is taking place and the reports are made available as means of verification. And the status of the biodiversity of the ecosystem services are also demonstrated with evidence. So the site is a geographically defined area. So the site has a geographically defined boundaries. And there's a map available that can be shown and made available to anybody. So the governance of the site assures the achievement of long-term and sustained conservation results. The quality of the governance is acceptable to achieve the in situ conservation results. So the official documents of the governance structure, the regular meetings, minutes on this structure, and the decisions made and follow up to those decisions are means of verification. The site is governed and managed by legitimate authorities. So the authorities managing the site and responsible for governance are legally recognized. This was what I was referring to before. That in some cases, the local governance and management has been happening in an ad hoc manner. So it may require some official structure to make it more acceptable and legitimate at the national and international level. And the site has a defined management model. I'm not going to read all the indicators, but the idea is to make sure that they have procedures to do the monitoring of the objectives and goals, that the structure allows for conservation, the groups of interest participate, and there's a adaptive management approach to the site. Also, the sites are in C. The sites are effective in achieving positive results in situ biodiversity conservation. And there's the site addresses the management, has the conservation, the management targets identified, the focal management targets identified, the threats and how the threats act upon the targets, and they have the procedures and documents and instruments for monitoring. The conservation results remain in space and time, and the site has the required financial and legal support to ensure long-term conservation. And this is one point also where we normally find weaknesses, particularly regarding financial. And this is something that has to probably build up. I say probably because there might be other sites that have been very successful at building a support base for the financial sustainability. But normally it's a weakness, and it has to be enhanced and strengthened. Under criterion D, ecosystem functions and services are conserved. The site assures the functionality of the ecological processes in the long term, and the conservation of the ecosystem service, particular one, does not compromise the conservation of biodiversity. So if the site is being conserved to provide water, the provision of water to cities or hydroelectric plant does not compromise the conservation of biodiversity. Cultural, socioeconomic, and other relevant values are respected and managed properly. And so there's the management structure and respect and identification of the value of those additional values. And governance and management respect the knowledge, practices, and institutions that are fundamental for the conservation of biodiversity. So in the case of the governance, how do we propose to assess it? And for this, we use different input already developed by IED, IUCN as well. One is called the SAPA, the GAPA, and there's all the framework knowledge of governance provided by IUCN. And there are new additional instruments and knowledge that's been developed over time that we need to be incorporating for the case of OECMs. So overall, we want to look into participation, transparency, accountability, mitigation of negative effects, and the distribution of benefits. And that we provide mechanisms for these things to happen, the decision-making responsibilities, the flow of information and participation of others, actions to optimize distribution of benefits, very important. The assessing the social impact, and also having mitigation plans for potential negative effects of the site conservation. So we have provided in the guide a conceptual framework, a glossary of terms, the analysis of barriers and opportunities, a bibliography with all the sources that I've been mentioning and more, the case studies in Honduras and El Salvador in more detail, and a tool for registration and monitoring of the criteria. Here you see the example in Spanish, unfortunately, of how the information and the means of verification, what is missing, and the ranking and the rating of the indicators can be registered and can be saved and used over time to compare annual or periodic assessments, monitoring performance. Next, I'm going to talk about the case study in Honduras. It's called the Lagoon System Caratasca. It's a very important site on terrestrial biodiversity, but also fresh water. And the local communities have a strong connection with the fresh water and dependence on the fishing. And the site is managed locally by 5 indigenous territorial authorities that have divided up the territory where the lagoon system is contained. Here you can see in the map, this is Honduras, and Caratasca is in this section of the country. And this is a close-up of the lagoon system where the 5 indigenous conservation authorities thrive. And this is a look of how the ecosystem, how the geography of the site looks. These are the work sessions we had with them. Representatives of the 5 groups, also IUCN, and the Forest Conservation Institute, responsible for protect areas in the country, eventually OECMs, I guess. And like the photos I'll show you for the workshops in Honduras and El Salvador. This was a more applied workshop in Caratasca where they actually ranked or rated the indicators based on their reality. They have a lot of work to do with all the different criteria and indicators. As you can see, all the color cards, structured so that they could be providing their feedback in a participatory approach, discussing and sharing their points of view of how the indicators are rated for their case in Caratasca. So we made sure that all the indicators were reviewed and rated. And some results are shown in these tables. So for criterion A, total 2 indicators, and they have the 2. They achieved the 2, so they have 100% performance on that one. Criterion B is 7 indicators. They have achieved 4 so far. So that's a 57% performance. In C, 4 indicators, they have met 2, so that's 50%. Same with criterion D, also 50%. And overall, the performance is 59%, which represents 10 of 17 indicators. So this was very interesting. And it looks a bit dry here in this table, but it was very much more detailed, as you saw in the photos with the color cards. And in the case of governance, for instance, they had to discuss and identify what is that is missing. For instance, here in number 2, transparency is based on timely, adequate access to relevant information. There are 2 indicators. They haven't achieved any of them. So they have work to do here. They have full and effective participation of all relevant actors in decision-making. 6 indicators, they have met 6. So that's 100%. So they're doing very well there. So if we look overall here in these governance indicators, they have work to do, but they are not doing really bad in overall the indicators. So the idea here is where you have a 0, a 33%, you have to develop actions of what you're going to do to improve that situation, that condition. So it's in the criterion A, it's not a protected area. Well, some of these they have met. Yes, but they're still short in the governance indicators like you saw in the previous one. So there's information missing on that, things that have to be done, things that need to happen, and means of verification that have to be collected. This one is, I don't want you to read all this, but this is more of criteria B and D. And we can see some indicators that they haven't met and pending actions that need to complete in order to be able to meet the indicators. So these actions, the opportunity is to have current projects that work with them or government institutions or themselves were to be able to complete these pending actions, or like is the case here too in the criterion D, where there's evidence missing, where they need studies to show illegal practices that degrade biodiversity in the case of sea cucumbers in mangroves, for instance. So this, if you can portray this condition, similar condition, to a site that you know that could be an OECM, what would be some of these things, some of these indicators would need to improve, where they need means of verification, where they need to take some actions to be able to meet some of these indicators. The same here with the criterion E, documents that need to be translated into the mother tongue, popular versions of some documents that are too technical and need to be revised and summarized for popular versions for everybody to read and understand. Some of these actions are very important that need to be addressed. Or here on criterion E, they need to strategize to reduce impacts and see how they're going to frame the distribution of benefits among local people, very important, and the reporting. So those are things that need to be improved. And celebrates the things that they are doing well and make sure they maintain those things ongoing. So in summary, a conclusion about the case study, well, we learned that they need to provide evidence that the governance and the management are contributing to conserve biodiversity and to maintain ecosystem services. They need to develop a strategy that allows to identify, understand, and mitigate potential negative effects that the site management could be generating to local communities, and also identify and understand the distribution of the benefits to the local communities. And about the guide, the method, it's feasible to apply it. The application was easy and understandable. It was focused on generating actions based on evidence. allows for midterm planning, and can be complemented with protected areas management effectiveness data. Those are the conclusions that we reach with them, with the local people, and they are already looking forward. They're already actually engaged in some of these improvement actions that need to complete, and looking forward to a future assessment later this year, a follow-up assessment. So that's for me, and I welcome any comments or questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Jose. Very interesting. Definitely looking at the guide and the perspective, the Honduras perspective. I think what we will do is reserve the questions for the question and answer section.
Okay.
So,
Yes.
okay, so we will move on. Just like with protected areas, of course, there's the reporting aspect once they are actually recognized and established. And so I'm now going to hand over to Emily Howland, who is going to give us some insight into the already existing world database on OECMs.
Hi all, thanks Julian. I'm just going to quickly share my slides. It's working. So hi everyone, my name is Emily Howland. I am a Programme Officer at UNEP-WCMC, the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre. I work very closely with the Caribbean Protected Areas Gateway, CPAG and IUCN on reporting data on other effective area-based conservation measures. So today I'm going to give a very quick presentation on the process for reporting information at the global scale to protected planet. So a very quick introduction first to UNEP-WCMC. The UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre is a centre of excellence on biodiversity based in Cambridge in the United Kingdom. And we work to ensure that science, knowledge and insight are at the heart of national and global policy, particularly collaborating with a range of stakeholders and different actors to place biodiversity and data at the forefront of decision-making considerations. Today, I'm going to give a very brief presentation on the process to monitor and report data on protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures at the global scale, focusing on reporting of OECMs. So I'll start by introducing Protected Planet. The Protected Planet Initiative is a platform for collating and sharing data on protected areas and OECMs worldwide. It's a joint product of IUCN and the UN Environment Programme and is managed by UNEP-WCMC here in Cambridge. It has an online platform which allows a range of users to explore information either online or through downloaded versions of the data, and provides key resources and tools to inform on the current state of protected and conserved areas globally. Protected Planet has several databases. The first is the World Database on Protected Areas, which is the most comprehensive global database of protected areas. And the second is the World Database on Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures, which is a far newer database and an evolving database, collating information on conservation areas aside from protected areas. There's also the Global Database on Protected Area Management Effectiveness, which provides information on where management effectiveness assessments have been carried out and reported. And finally, slightly separately, Protected Planet also has close links to the ICCA registry, a database of the territories and areas conserved by Indigenous peoples and local communities. So data is provided to Protected Planet through a variety of sources. There are over 400 data providers for the WCPA and the WCOECM. the majority of which are national governments, as well as convention secretariats, Indigenous peoples, local communities, and private actors. We also collaborate very closely with regional entities who facilitate data collection from a regional level to a global level. This includes regional observatories under the Biodiversity Protected Areas Management Programme, BIOPAMA, and in the Caribbean, this is CPAG. So the World Database on OECMs. The WCPA is a far newer database than the World Database on Protected Areas. It was established in 2019 in response to a request from parties to the CBD in 2018. The database is updated on a monthly basis, and as of April this year, there were 856 OECMs reported for 10 countries and territories, and this includes 55 OECMs reported for Colombia. The WCPA is a spatial or GIS database. It includes 3 types of data. The spatial or GIS data, which is polygons of OECM's boundary of an OECM, or the point coordinates of the centermost point of an OECM if the spatial polygon is not available. There's also associated tabular information, including a list of attributes which describe each OECM reported to the database. There's 30 data fields in total, including information such as the site name, its designation, and the year the designation came into place. And then slightly separately, there is also metadata, which provides information on the data within the WDOECM and the data source. So once an OECM has been identified, it can then be reported to the World Database. Information can be provided by a range of data providers. The majority of information has, however, been provided by national governments. In fact, I think for OECMs, all data so far has been provided by national governments. The data shared on Protected Planet is updated every month, and we ask data providers to update their data as soon as possible to reflect any changes on the ground. This means that there is a lot of variation in the frequency of data updates across different countries. There's a data manual which describes the databases and the required information in detail, which is available to download from Protected Planet and available in multiple languages. To give a very quick overview of the process to report data to the World Database on OECMs, there are 3 key steps. Firstly, consent must be given by the governance authority of the site. This is the people who are making the decisions on the ground about how the OECM is managed. For example, this could be the government, Indigenous people, local community, or private organizations or individuals. In the case of Indigenous peoples and local communities, consent must be given in the format of free, prior, and informed consent. Once consent is agreed, the second step is to format the data correctly and make sure all the relevant information has been provided for each site. There are a set of database standards which are shown on the right-hand side of the screen. And these are described in detail in the user manual. But to briefly introduce them, these are that sites must meet the definition of an OECM. Spatial data must be provided, and the associated attribute data or tabular information should also be provided. Source information must be provided as well, alongside these describing the data provider. And a data contributor agreement is required in almost all cases, which ensures that there is a written record of the data provider agreeing for their data to be included in the databases and the terms for which this information is then available. So once the data has been assured to meet these database standards, the final step is ensuring verification. So the role of data verifiers is to confirm that, to the best of their knowledge, the data that has been submitted is correct information. And the data verifiers can comment on the data accuracy and the process by which the data has been collected. For government sites, the government will typically verify their own data, and so the data provider and verifier will likely be the same person. For non-government actors, if they wish to provide data directly to the World Database, they can decide whether their data will be verified by experts or by the national government. The expert verification process is currently rarely used, but is intended to support the integration of data on protected areas or OECMs that are under the governance of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and private actors. So data for the Caribbean. In the Caribbean region, as I mentioned, we collaborate very closely with CPAG, who work to ensure that protected area and OECM data is collated and updated in Protected Planet. CPAG really facilitate the flow of information from the national to the regional level and then up to the global scale through supporting the collation of data and supporting building the capacity of national stakeholders across the region. In the Caribbean, data providers are asked to share updated information on either protected areas or OECMs to both CPAG and UNEP-WCMC. CPAG engage commonly with national contacts and support the process of collating this data and information, which UNEP-WCMC can then review and ensure meets the database standards. And then finally, on why to report data. So OECMs offer a significant opportunity to increase recognition and support for de facto effective long-term conservation that is taking place outside currently designated protected areas under a range of governance and management regimes implemented by a diverse set of actors. Having this data visible at a global scale provides further recognition for the work and commitment of governments, private individuals, organizations, and communities whose contributions to conservation should be celebrated. Having available information of the world's OECMs, in addition to protected areas, can be used across a range of stakeholders to inform decisions, develop policies, and guide conservation action. And accurate information allows us to identify gaps or limitations in the current network and to prioritize future conservation efforts. Global data also allows us to track progress towards international biodiversity targets on protected areas and OECMs. The WDPA and the WD-OECM are both formally mandated by the Convention on Biological Diversity. The data provided the official indicator of progress towards the former IHE Target 11 and now provides the headline indicator towards Target 3, the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The databases are also used for the official indicators on progress towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals 14 and 15, life below water and life on land, alongside global data on key biodiversity areas. So I apologize that it's quite small, but on the right, there is a map of the data that is currently reported to both the World Database on Protected Areas and World Database on OECMs. Terrestrial protected areas are shown in green, marine protected areas and coastal areas are shown in blue, and OECMs are shown in orange. So you can see on the map that there are relatively few OECMs reported in comparison to protected areas. However, if you look at the coverage percentage, the percentage coverage statistics which are displayed below the app, we can see that OECMs add an additional 1.18% coverage to the Earth's surface. So they're already making a significant impact, even though only a small number have currently been reported. And we expect that OECMs will cover a really vast area of the world when fully mapped in all countries and are likely to make a large difference to coverage if reported and with the consent of their governing authorities and provided appropriate support as well. Finally, I just wanted to quickly mention as well the Protected Planet reports, which are one way which we at UNEP-WCMC and IUCN monitor the progress towards international targets. So they are biannual publications that provide a picture of the global state of protected and conserved areas. This includes moving beyond coverage to consider effectiveness, equitable governance of areas, as well as connectivity of landscapes, areas of importance for biodiversity and ecological representation of the global network. Each are important elements of Target 3, and in the final quarter of this year, the 2024 report will be launched, which will be the first in the series to track progress towards Target 3 at the Global Biodiversity Framework. For data to be included in the analysis for this report, we're asking that data providers submit any information by June 2024. And this will be for OECMs, protected areas, and management effectiveness of protected areas as well. And that's all I have. I think we're having questions at the end, but if there is anything, please say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Emily, And now we're going to move on to our next section. As identified, one of the key outcomes that we're hoping is to use this webinar to kickstart the development of a discussion paper, kind of stemming from what was done in the Cook Islands. And so we're going to have Benjamin Lucas, who is from UNEP-WCMC as well, give us an introduction to the experience of the Cook Islands.
Thank you, Julian, and hi, everyone. My name is Ben Lucas. I'm a program officer within Protected Planets at UNEP-WCMC. And as Julian mentioned, I'm here to talk about the Cook Islands and our experience in the Pacific working with OECMs. So this work was funded primarily by the BIOPAMA program with additional support from ACP MEAs 3. And following a region-wide workshop on OECMs in the Pacific, the Cook Islands signified their interest in working more closely with our team, which is UNEP-WCMC, IUCN, and SPREP, on OECMs. So with that, we collectively engaged in a process to support recognition and reporting of OECMs for the Cook Islands. The first step in this was running an in-country workshop. And this brought together stakeholders from across the country, from government, non-government, the private sector, and local communities, to introduce them to OECMs and to see how it might be relevant to them. We also ran through some exercises on identifying potential OECMs in the country, including using the IUCN assessment tool. And then, based on a broad literature review of Pacific and Cook Islands protected and conserved areas, supported by the learnings and outcomes of this workshop, we produced a discussion paper to support the Cook Islands in their OECM process. So this discussion paper is available online if you'd like to take a look. It starts out broadly introducing what OECMs are, specifically in the Pacific and Cook Islands context. It then goes through some case studies of OECMs that might be relevant to the Cook Islands, to provide some practical examples to readers, for example, such as community fishing areas from elsewhere in the world. The paper looks at the benefits and potential drawbacks to recognizing OECMs for the Cook Islands, mainly based on discussions among participants in the workshop. We also go through some examples of potential OECMs in the Cook Islands, which were identified in the workshop through discussions, but also through literature review of Cook Islands protected area examples and legislation. And then finally, we provide recommendations to the Cook Islands National Environment Service on how to move forward with OECM recognition and reporting in the country. And this was all done in collaboration with the Cook Islands National Environment Service, as well as IUCN and SPREP, the Regional Observatory for the Pacific. And this, since the publishing of the discussion paper, the Cook Islands National Environment Service have been working really hard to push forward OECMs in the country. And a key site that was identified in the workshop was the Takatumu Conservation Area, which now, through the hard work of the National Environment Service, as well as the Takatumu Conservation Area Coordinating Committee, has now gone through a complete OECM assessment and has been confirmed as an OECM. And we're now working with SPREP and NES to process that data for submission to the World Database on OECMs. And this is a lovely example. It's a conservation area managed primarily for protection of the breeding grounds of the Rarotonga flycatcher, but also for other biodiversity values, such as providing shelter to a number of endangered and native species. The management of the site is overseen by the Takatumu Conservation Area Trust, which collaborates with the government, local landowners, and the local community to safeguard the biodiversity in this area. So we're really happy with this OECM going through, and we've seen some real impact with this discussion paper. I'm very excited to hear about the potential for one in the Caribbean, and yes, do feel free to get in touch if you have any questions, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ben, so much for that. So what I will do is just go ahead to the development of a discussion paper for the Caribbean region. We recognize that there are at present no established OECMs within the region, and that could be for a number of reasons because persons are not fully understanding what should be designated, perhaps not understanding the process of designating, recognizing, and designating OECMs. And so looking at the experience of the Cook Islands, CPAG along with IUCN and UNEP-WCMC, saw it fitting that perhaps the development of a discussion paper for the Caribbean could help for us to kickstart our recognition and establishment of OECMs within the Caribbean region. And so not trying to invent the wheel, having this discussion paper provides an excellent starting point to act as a reference document so that we can develop our discussion paper to help to provide information for persons and groups that are interested in area-based conservation. And as you can imagine, within the Caribbean, there are sites that are already fulfilling or meeting the criteria for OECMs. And so perhaps it's just having the support to go ahead and establish these areas, which then in turn can help to contribute to the new global biodiversity target of conserving 30% of both our marine and terrestrial-based areas. And the idea is that the discussion paper itself would help to provide a snapshot. So it would help to provide where we are with respect to the global context of OECMs, but more specifically with the regional context within the Caribbean, and potentially seeing how we can move forward to have the establishment of OECMs within the Caribbean. And it would also help to identify the process of recognizing and reporting OECMs. And as Emily just said, a lot of the data that are found within these databases are used by the Convention of Biological Diversity, CITES, IPBES, for us to monitor the progress that we're making towards the various targets and goals that are in existence. And so for us, the process of doing that obviously starts today through this online webinar, where of course we are raising awareness towards the concept of OECMs and the recognition and designation of OECMs within the Caribbean region, but more specifically to try to ascertain interests from you, the participants, practitioners, stakeholders throughout the region with respect to identifying, recognizing, and designating OECMs. And so we recognize that there may be specific questions that persons may have that they need to answered to be able to move forward, or there may be interest around specific concepts or areas of interest that we can come together and work through to be able to try to move this area forward within the Caribbean. So the idea is just like as was done in the Cook Islands, potentially stemming from this workshop, once we have identified countries, organizations, entities that are interested in the process, that we can potentially have a subsequent workshop where we invite interested parties to come together. Potentially we can have a more in-depth look at the guide and the process, try to identify within the Caribbean region and at national levels, what are the potential benefits, what are the opportunities, and what are some of the threats that may be associated with the identification of OECMs. And then based on that, developing some recommendations for how we go about this process in the Caribbean, recognizing that the process for identifying OECMs obviously will not be the same from region to region, and even within a specific region from country to country. And so we need to recognize that. And then stemming from that, hopefully that can then be used to kickstart the development of a discussion paper, which we hope will be done in a collaborative manner, utilizing persons from within countries who are obviously interested. So that is our, at this point, intended process. And so we have just a couple of questions that we would like to ask. What we've done is actually develop some polls, but the idea is that we would like from you to try to identify for the participants, are there any countries that are currently investigating the recognition and the establishment of OECMs? If yes, we would like to get a sense of what stage that process have been. Have countries identified, they're still looking to, or are they at the stage of trying to establish these? And then finally, we would also like to see what sites within countries may potentially serve as OECMs. So what I will do, I will launch the first poll. And I recognize that a lot of information has been shared. The recording and the presentations will be shared. And so we recognize that you may have to share this information with other colleagues to then provide us with an answer. That is fine. So at this point, I would just give you 1 minute for those of you to provide any input on the first question with respect to, are there any countries currently investigating the recognition and establishment of OECMs? Feel free to also, if you want to provide any information, context in the chat, feel free to do so as well. All right, I'm going to end the first poll and I'm going to move on to the second one. So if you indicated that yes, your specific country is investigating or in the process, then it would be nice to identify what stage you are at within the process. Is it just, yes, we recognize that this is an area to move, but nothing else? Or have you already identified and perhaps seeking support in the establishment, or have you already started the process of establishing OECMs within your country? So once again, I'll just pause for a minute to allow for any responses, and then we would go on to the final question that you can see there. All right. And then thirdly, on to the final poll, potentially what sites, if you are aware of any sites within your country that you think could potentially qualify as an OECM, it would be nice for you to share the country and the name of that site as well. If I ended a particular poll too quickly, feel free to share that information in the chat, or as you will see on my final slide, I will provide contact information that you can always contact us after today's webinar to provide any information, ask any questions that you may have. All right, so I'm going to end the final poll. So with that, I would like to thank those of you who participated. And then, as I said, finally, I just wanted to share some contact information for those of you who may be interested and would like to be part of the discussion paper, to get more information on the guides, the process of recognizing OECMs maybe be part of our subsequent workshop, then feel free to contact any of us through CPAG, IUCN, or UNEP-WCMC. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I imagine potentially there are some questions. So at this point, I will hand over to my colleague, Hyacinth, who will facilitate the question and answer component.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Ben, for the inputs, and Jose as well. So we've had a lot of information shared with you. I know there was some feedback given to Julian in the polls. And so I'm just going to now go into the Q&A section. And there's actually only one question here. So are there any others that are brewing? You can type them in the chat, or if not, no, sorry, type them in the Q&A section. We have a little bit time to do that. But Jose, during your presentation, when you were identifying or giving examples, sorry, of probable and not probable OECMs, you indicated that urban parks were not probable OECMs. So Andre Bash wants to know why that is the case.
Generally, thank you for the question. Generally, urban parks are man-built or human-built systems. They usually, and not all the cases though, but usually contain many introduced species of plants and trees, and are not focused particularly on protecting local national biodiversity. They also combine, it's not the main purpose to protect biodiversity or ecosystem services, and perhaps that's the main reason. But also they combine the design of the urban parks with other services, for instance, sports, exercises, pet sections, and so on. So they serve interests that are important for a city or a community, not necessarily for biodiversity or ecosystem services. And that's in the majority, but I have to say that it's not everyone or every urban park. There are some rather large urban parks that probably are interested in some sort of biodiversity conservation or landscape conservation in the sense of aesthetics, not particularly on species in the long term. That's why we said not probable, but I'm pretty sure that some exception may be out there that could be breaking this rule. So looking forward to hearing and learning from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Andre, I hope that answered your question clearly for you. Please let us know if you have a follow-up to it. Another question, and I think Jose, this might come back to you as well. What is the relationship between OECMs and conservation easements?
Was that for me too?
I think so. I think you're probably the most qualified on the call.
Yeah, is that conservation easement?
Easement, yes.
Yes, the conservation easements, in my opinion, I'm familiar with the figure, are potential OECMs, definitely. As long as they are not recognized as protected areas. Okay. There are some figures in some countries that related a little bit to easements, but they have been included in the legislation of the protected area system. So that particular situation doesn't allow the sites to meet criterion A because they are recognized as protected areas, or maybe not managed as well as the official protected areas, but they are included in the protected area system, so that keeps them from being OECMs. But in general, the regional figure of the easement, in my opinion, OECMs all around. Yes.
Thank you, Jose. And does that answer your question? If so, you can give a thumbs up. All right, another question posed is, could you elaborate a bit on the benefits of obtaining the OECM status? Now, I know we spoke within my presentation and Jose's presentation, we gave some evidence of the value of having OECMs. I will take the opportunity just to at least share from Jose's presentation just a reminder of what those are. So out of the decision, the OECMs must conserve the biodiversity value, and they represent an opportunity to preserve these values in the long term. They can contribute significantly to the conservation of this ecosystems, functions, and services, and therefore they contribute to conservation networks. They are comparable and complementary with protected areas. And then they also can assist in achieving other elements of the targets in the post-2030 framework. Now, in terms of this question posed, the benefits of obtaining the status would definitely allow countries to report further, at least without the additional resources, if that's the best word, for reporting on coverage and achieving that status of the target 3 in terms of percentage protection, and this type of protection in terms of equitable and effective management and governance. And also, it can also help to, again, incorporate, depending on the space, the integration of the indigenous peoples and local communities, territories. Jose, I don't know if you want to elaborate further on what could be the benefits of obtaining the status of an OECM.
Yes, we have discussed this broadly throughout this process of developing the guide and learning more about OECMC in Central America. It's a key aspect of the whole implementation of OECMs. Why would I get involved into this? And we discussed this with the local people, and they gave us very good reasons. They obviously see the potential of enhancing and expanding the work of conservation they have been doing for some time at an international level. It's one thing if you're called the private reserve X, Y, or Z from country A, B, C, as opposed to being acknowledged and recognized as an OECM of country A, B, or C. And you could be reported in an international database and recognized. It presents for you opportunities that you should be able to tackle, regardless, I don't know, increased visitation in case you have a tourism operation ongoing, or if you have production of sustainable agricultural products or non-timber forest products. All these represent potential and opportunity of incentives to take advantage of being recognized as an OECM. Bottom line, like we're doing, we're going to start working in Honduras and Panama, and hopefully El Salvador, we'll be developing a national policy of OECMs, and all the rules of the game will be clear in the policy for each country. They will decide how they want to approach. And one important component of this, actually two I should mention. One, to avoid greenwashing, and two, what are the incentives of getting involved with OECMs? Either if my property has been doing conservation for decades, or if I want to engage now and start in conservation thanks to this approach of OECMs. So